Hi everyone, Becky here and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be sewing up the Beachy Tank from Sustainable Cloth Company, and I'm going to be doing the Cami dress version with a full button down front. So we are using, this is a woven pattern, so you need a woven fabric, and this is the fabric that I'm going to be using for the dress, and I will be walking you through the steps of the pattern to make this dress, including going through the binding and the placket and all of that. So you got to get your fabric, you need some interfacing, and then make sure you get your iron fired up. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and we'll get started. I know I said in the intro the styles I was doing, the options, but I'm going to just go ahead and remind you. So I said I'm doing the cami top in the knee length dress. So for the cami, you have the option of a crop top, a top length, or the knee length dress, and you have a key on your pattern piece that will show you which lines are which. So make sure you just check that before you cut, that you have the proper length. And I'm doing the knee length dress, which is this bottom straight line. But if you are doing any of the other options, the length options, it's not going to change the construction. It's just going to give you a shorter finished garment. For all of the cami options, you are only going to use one pattern piece for the body. The pattern piece is the same for the front and back. The only difference is whether you're doing a solid front, the button down front, or the Henley front. So I am doing the full button down front, as I stated. The back is going to be one solid piece. The front, I'm going to do one solid piece, but then I'm going to cut it down the center. If you are doing the Henley, you will have the front mostly solid. You will just have a cut. You will cut here and as well as that V. So for the cami, we need our front bodice in whichever style we decided, the cut front, solid front, or the Henley front, and then the back, and then we just need our binding pieces. So I'm going to go ahead and get started getting those cut out. I am going to go real quick and give my fabric a press because I forgot to do that before I brought it over here. So I'm going to give it a quick press just to flatten it out. Then I'll start cutting it out. And when you are working with wovens, they tend to get really wrinkly, so you do want to give them a good press. And if you are working with a fabric that is kind of shifty or slides around really easily, you may want to give it a nice spray with some spray starch to stiffen it up a little bit before you start working with it. Once you are done cutting out, I did forget to mention that you needed to cut the placket piece as well as the interfacing for the placket. So you're going to have your two front piece bindings, and this is going to be the same for if you are doing the Henley placket as well. If you are doing a basic solid front, you will have just two of the neck binding pieces. So if you're doing the front, because you have to combine them, so you're going to have two smaller pieces, then you are going to have your back binding, your armhole binding, your neck plackets. You'll have two, or button down plackets, sorry, two plackets, two interfacing. I like to cut my interfacing a little bit smaller than my piece just to reduce bulk in the seams. That's kind of a personal preference, but I always find it to work a lot better for me that way. Then you'll have your back piece, which again is solid, no seam, and then your front piece, which is two opposites or the same piece just cut straight down the middle. And real quick before we move on to our first step of construction, I wanted to talk about the binding. You can omit these pieces if you have store-bought double fold bias tape. That is basically what we're going to be making out of this. That is perfectly fine. The issue with that is not really an issue, but your limitation is you are not going to really be able to pick from very many colors. You might have a decent selection, but it might not be a perfect match to your fabric. and it just kind of limits you on that. It's really easy to make your own, and I will take you through that here later of how I make my own with these pieces. But the biggest thing is when you cut it out, you want to make sure you cut it on the bias. And what that means is you are taking your grain line and you are cutting your piece at a 45-degree angle. So my grain line here on these pieces is all going diagonally. And what that does is it takes this woven fabric that has no stretch this way, but has a little bit of stretch on the bias. So that's just going to give us a little bit of give and make it lay a little bit nicer when we are attaching that to our garment. The first thing we're going to do construction-wise is we are going to take our placket pieces and our interfacing that we cut, and we're going to apply our interfacing. So what you're going to do is you're just going to come over to an ironing board, and we're going to turn your placket piece right side down so your wrong side is up, and I'm going to take my interfacing, and as I mentioned, I like to cut it a little bit shorter, typically about the seam allowance difference, just so that it doesn't bulk up, because that gives you 2 extra layers in those seams. And I will be showing you a way that I prefer to do my button plackets to make it a little bit nicer and enclose the seams, and it adds another layer, so you just really want to reduce that bulk if you can. But what you're going to do is you just want to make sure that the bumpy side, which is the fusible side, is touching the wrong side of the fabric. We're just going to line it up on there, and you're just going to press this on both pieces. And you just double check that the fusible part, which is like the glue of your interfacing, is down before you put your iron on it, or you will end up with a big mess. And we are going to do that on both of our pieces. And if you are doing the Henley placket, you will be following these same steps as well. You will just have a much shorter placket piece. So once you get your interfacing pressed on, what you're going to do is you are going to fold your piece in half with your wrong sides together, so your interfacing sides are going inside, and you are just going to press it down the middle and give it a nice crease in the middle there. And we're going to do that, we'll repeat that on the other piece, but I'm not going to show you that just to save some time. Once you have your placket piece interfaced and pressed in half, the instructions they take you front bodice piece, your front bodice piece with the right side up, and simply you line up your raw edges at the top here, and line up your raw edges all the way down, and just have you sew this on here. And that is perfectly fine. It's definitely the quicker way to do it, but I prefer to have an enclosed edge here instead of having a raw edge, because then you have to finish it and it just doesn't look quite as nice. So it does take a little bit more time to do and a few extra steps, but if you have the time to do the few extra steps, you're definitely not going to regret it. So what I do is, if you have a directional fabric, which I do not, my print is a tossed print, which means it goes in all different directions. But if you have a directional print, just make sure you're paying attention to which way your fabric is going and which way you're attaching it, so that you don't end up with an upside down placket, because that's the last thing you want. But so what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this up a little bit, and since our seam allowance is 1/2 inch, I'm going to do it on this side here closest to me. I am going to press up one side of the placket on the inside with raw edges together 1/2 of an inch. That's not 1/2 inch. There we go. And so what this does is then I'm going to sew it on, and I will walk you through the steps of this, and then I will top stitch it down so that this seam and the raw edges all end up on the inside of this placket and you can't see them. So we're just going to press this up 1/2 inch. You only need to do this on one side of your placket piece, but you will need to do it on both placket pieces. 1/2 inch, and then I like to just go over it again, fold it in half so that I can get that seam in there. You may have pressed that middle fold out just a little bit, which is okay, but we want to make sure we have that on there. So once you have this pressed down, and if you flip it over, you're going to see you have a nice clean edge here and your raw edge. What we're going to do is we're going to take our front bodice and our placket piece, and we're going to open it up. We're going to take the raw edge that was not folded, and we are going to line it up. The raw edge is up at the top, and I don't have my pins over here, so I'll just walk you through it. But we're going to start up at the top at the neckline, line up your raw edges with right at the top, and line up that raw edge all the way down to your hemline. And you're going to pin it, and then what we're going to do is we're just going to go over to our machine, and we are going to stitch with a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way from the top and bottom. So I'll go do that and be right back. Once you get that sewn on, it's going to look something like this. And your next thing you're going to do is you're going to flip it wrong sides out, and you are going to press your seam towards your placket. So you're going to press it flat away towards the body of your garment. I'm going to just make sure you're pressing that seam nice and even all the way down. So what you're doing is you're just folding that, basically folding it into your placket, because our next step, I do need my pins for that, hang on. So what we're going to do next is we're going to take our placket and fold it over, and we're going to keep that raw edge down underneath. So we're going to pin, I'm going to come over to the front here because we want to top stitch it, so we want our pins on the top, and you're going to just pin this down, making sure you're catching that folded edge in there when you fold it. So once you get all of your pins in, you are going to top stitch this. Starting up at the top, you're going to go about 1/8 of an inch all the way down, and what that's going to do is it's going to catch this folded edge in the back, and it's going to enclose all of those seams. So it really only adds about an extra step, because otherwise you would have to finish those edges if you were not doing it this way. So I'm going to finish getting this pinned and top stitch it, and I am also going to do that on my other side of my front bodice. Repeat these exact same steps, and then I will be back. So once you have both sides completed, you can see, so this is my front, and I did the top stitch on the inside of the placket there, which is the opposite of the instructions, just because I don't have that seam to press down on the inside. But so this is the inside, and you can just see how nice and clean that looks, instead of having some sort of raw edge or serged edge just top stitched down here. And so like I said, that's personal preference. You can do it how I did it. You can do it as written in the instructions, but I just wanted to show you that option in case that's what you wanted. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to make our bias tape for the bindings. And so these are the front neckline. So you have the two shorter pieces are your front neckline, and the steps are going to be the same for the front neckline, the back neckline, and the straps. But the only difference for the front is you are going to fold over one edge, and I will just show you that. But in order to make our bias tape for all of our pieces, we're going to start by folding it in half and pressing it. So you're just going to fold your raw edges together with wrong sides together and give it a nice press down the middle. Once that is nice and pressed, you're going to open it back up. Then we are going to take our raw edge on one side and fold it down to that middle fold that you made with your first press. So we're going to just press that and give that a nice fold there. Then you are going to do your other side. You're going to do the same thing, lining it up about as close as you can to the raw edge of the other piece that you folded over in the middle without them touching. And so you can see here I have both pieces folded into the middle. And once you do that, you are just going to fold them back on top of each other so that your folded edges and the raw edges are on the inside in the middle. And you're just going to give it another press to put that crease back in the middle because it may have pressed out a little bit when you pressed those first pieces. So then that is it. That's all you have to do for these pieces. You won't have to piece anything together, which makes it nice and simple. You will do that for your front neck binding if you're doing the basic cami front, and you will have 2 for the Henley or the snap, the full placket down the front, and then you will have the neck piece and the arms. So the only difference is for the front pieces, we are going to be lining this up with the placket, and so we want to have a nice clean edge. So what you're going to do is you're just going to open it up here a little bit, and you are going to fold one edge, and again, make sure you're paying attention if you have a directional fabric, because you do not want to do all of this and then end up with your binding upside down. That's not fun. So you're going to fold it in a 1/2 inch and give it a nice press. And then you're just going to kind of fold those pieces back in on themselves and give that center seam a nice press. And you're going to do that for both front pieces, and then like I said, you will do the double fold without the front piece for all of your other pieces. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up all of my binding pieces. Once you have your bindings made, we're going to start with our front bodice pieces. And what we're going to do is we are going to take our pieces for the front neckline, which are the ones that we folded towards the end, and we are going to we're going to work on one side at a time. We're going to take our folded edge here, we're going to line that up with the side of our placket, and the raw edge we're going to line up with the raw edge of the neckline. So I am going to pin that on there, and I do sometimes like to put a little bit of, I like to use Elmer's glue, just a purple glue stick, or a regular glue stick works too, to put a little bit on there just to make sure that those stay nice and lined up when you stitch and that they don't kind of pull apart from each other. But you're just going to pin this on all the way around, kind of ease it in to that curve. And you're going to go all the way up, and you might have a little bit of extra, and that is perfectly okay. But you want that lined up, and then you're just going to take it over to your sewing machine, and you are going to sew this on at that crease there. That's a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and this is a little bit different than what's written in the pattern. In the pattern they have you, here I'll show you on this piece just kind of briefly, they have you put it on both ways and pin it and fold it down and then top stitch it, but this kind of, just like the placket, I find gives a much nicer, cleaner finish, and it does add a couple more steps, but it just, for me personally, I believe it gives the best result. So I'm going to go ahead and do it on both of my front pieces. I'm going to stitch this on right here at that 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I will be back. Once you get your binding sewn on, it's going to look like this and kind of floppy. And what you're going to want to do, this is part of the reason why I also like doing it this way, because if you do it the other way and sew it all on at once, you won't be able to clip your seam allowance, which just helps it lay a little bit nicer because it is a curve and it helps it ease in. So I'm just going to do about 3 clips. Just, you're going to go in as close as you can, clipping that seam allowance up to, I'll do it on this side so you can kind of maybe see it, the orange, up to the stitches without cutting through. If you cut through, you're gonna have some issues with your garment. But this is just gonna help it lay a little bit nicer. And then you're going to take your binding and fold it over the back onto that seam. And you're gonna make sure you have everything tucked in there. So it's gonna hold it in, and you're going to pin on the front piece. And you're just gonna go all the way around doing that. And you'll do that on both your front and back. And you just wanna make sure, just like the placket, that you have your seam allowance all tucked in there, and you want the folded edge of your bias tape to be hitting at right about your stitch line. Once you have that pinned on there, you're just going to go over to your sewing machine, and you're going to top stitch this on with about 1/8 inch seam allowance, just like we did here. And you're going to be stitching on the binding, not the body. So up 1/8 inch off of the binding seam about along here, and you're going to do that on both of your front pieces. So you can see here I top stitched my binding on, and here is the back. So this is why you want to make sure that you get this down over your seam allowance, so that when you top stitch, you catch this in there. Otherwise you might have a gap, and if that happens, that's okay. You might have to hand stitch it closed, or depending on how bad it is, you may need to rip that out. So you just want to be really careful as you're sewing that to make sure you're catching that back in there. And I just wanted to show you too another benefit of doing it this method. Because you stitch this on and then folded it over, this is a nice tight seam here. There's no lip, where on the back you can see there's a little bit of a lip where you folded it and sewed it, and that just makes it lay nicer on the front. I think where if you fold it over and sew both sides, you're going to have that lip on both sides. So this again just gives a little bit of a cleaner finish in my opinion. But like I said, you can sew that on however you would like. Once you get your front done, you're going to take your back piece, and we're going to do pretty much the same thing. We just do not have to worry about the folded ends, because this is all of a raw edge. So we're just going to line it up. I'm not going to go through all of this. Line it up all the way around, stitch it, then we're going to clip it. You want to make sure you add a couple more clips into your seam allowance when you're cutting it, because this is a bigger curve than the front. So you want to do maybe about every inch or so for a clip into that seam allowance, and then you will fold it over and top stitch that again. Once you have your back neckline binding done, then we are going to move on to attaching the front and back. If you did the solid front, this is what it's going to look like. It's going to look just the same. You're going to have two pieces just like that. But since we are doing the full button down front, we are going to take right sides together, and we are going to line up both sides. We're going to line up our armpit mark and all the way down, and then we're just going to pin all the way down, and we are going to sew this up, and you are going to want to then finish this raw edge. And you can do that either by adding a zigzag stitch to your seam allowance or serging it, and I will be serging it. So you're going to do this on both sides. You want to line up your other side as well, and you're going to just stitch down. So I am going to do this, and I'm also going to do another step here. So I'll sew this up with 1/2 inch seam allowance, finish my edges with my serger, and then I'm also going to, while I'm over at my machine, I am going to take my arm binding, and what you're going to do is you're going to do this on both arm binding pieces. You're going to open it up. You're going to line up your raw edges of your short edge, and you are going to sew this at 1/2 inch seam allowance across to create a loop. So I'm going to go ahead and do all of that, and I'll be back. Right, so I sewed up my side seams, and you can see I serge that edge. Just make sure you don't, if you serge, that you don't go over your seam allowance of your straight stitch. But so once I have that sewn, you probably will have a little bit of extra on your neck bindings, which is okay. What we're going to do is we're going to just trim those off, and you want to trim them off in the angle of what your original piece was. So you don't want to just chop it off straight, because really inside of that binding there is that little piece of the pointed piece that was on your original pattern piece. So we're just going to trim those real quick. And then the arm binding pieces are going to be pretty similar to what we did on the neck bindings. The only difference is that we are going to have this kind of, not weird gap, but you're going to have a gap of your, where you aren't attaching your binding to anything besides itself. So you're going to take one arm binding piece and you're going to kind of just finger press this seam open a little bit, push your seams opposite directions. You are going to line up your raw edges and your side seam with your seam of your binding. And sorry, I keep losing my pin cushion. You're just gonna go around your arm side that you have, and then you're gonna stop up at the top. So we're gonna pin this onto here and do the same thing on the other side. And then when we go to stitch it on, we're going to do, where'd my pin go? The same thing. We are just going to stitch in the seam or the crease of a 1/2 inch on our binding as we're attaching it to our garment. And we're going to just start up where this binding piece from our front is, go all the way around, and then we're going to stop at our back piece. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and we're going to do that on both sides for the arms. Once you have sewn that on, it's going to look like this. So it should look like you have a strap now. What we're going to do, just like the neckline, we're going to snip our seam allowance just slightly all the way around, just where we stitched. We're not going to go up into the strap part where we did not attach it to anything. So we're going to do this on both sides. Just snip up to your stitch line. And if you need to, if you have a thick fabric, you could trim the seam allowance down a little bit, but this is a pretty thin fabric. But so what we're going to do is just like the other ones, okay, fold that seam, and then we're going to fold that down on the top there, and we're going to put a pin in it, and then we're just going to do that all the way around. You want to make sure that you keep your seam, your raw edges inside of this binding, pin it on there, and once you get to where you are off of, see, these like to pop out, so you just want to make sure you get them in there nice and good and really pay attention to that sewing. And this is also another good place to pause, take a look, make sure if you have a directional fabric that your binding is facing the right way and it's not upside down. Just a reminder there. But once you get to where you are off of the body, you're just going to push those folds together and just pin it together like that. And then we're just going to top stitch around it, and that will enclose the strap. So when you're stitching, you want to make sure that your folds line up really nicely with each other, that they're not off-centered, and that will just give it much better, cleaner finish. So we're just going to do that all the way around, and then just like the others, we will top stitch on our binding at 1/8 of an inch, and making sure when you are doing that that you are catching your fold in the back. You're going to do that all the way around, and you will do that on both sleeves. Once your straps are sewn, it will look like this. It's so cute. And the last thing for the construction that we have to do is we just have to hem. And so what you're going to do is you're going to press your hem up a 1/2 inch all the way down, and then you are going to fold it over again, excuse me, and press it down, and then you will top stitch that and your hem will be done. So once you stitched your hemline, you're basically done, and you can see here how nice and clean that looks on the inside. There's some phrase coming out of there, but then you nice and hem. And the one thing I did forget to mention, when you go to press your hem, you do want to make sure you line up your tops up here, and it's not a bad idea to pin down your front placket to make sure your bottom of your placket pieces line up when you fold them, otherwise you're going to end up with something wonky like that, and really the only way to fix it is to redo your hem, or you fudge buttons and then you have lumps in your placket. And so all you have left now is to, if you're going to add snaps, you'll add your snaps or buttons and buttonholes. And I decided, I think I told you guys, I bought these really cute fruit ones. I had this really great idea that these were going to be really cute, but once I put them on here, they kind of just get lost in there, and these are too cute to not be like a statement piece. So I changed my game plan, and I'm going to use these yellow buttons, and I'm going to be honest, I'm going to be lazy, and I am just going to sew the buttons on through the placket so that the placket is not going to be functional, but it'll look, you won't even really be able to tell. So I'm not going to do buttonholes, and the reason I'm doing that is, like I said, I'm being lazy, and the placket is really not necessary. You'll be able to get it on and off without having to unbutton it. So that's just what I'm gonna do. And you can do, like I said, snaps. You can do this way, you can do your lazy buttons, or you can do buttonholes and have functional buttons. Alright, I got my buttons sewn on, and like I said, I literally just stitched right through both plackets, and you cannot tell at all on the front, and when you're wearing it, it literally looks just like it would if you had buttons on it. And I'm really glad I went with the yellow. I did put a poll up on my Instagram when I was working on this if I should use the yellow or the fruit buttons, and it was voted by a landslide to just go with the yellow. And so if you like to be a part of that and want to kind of help me decide with some of these, I put polls up on my Instagram all the time for projects I'm working on, tutorials I'm working on, and just other fun things. So make sure you follow me on Instagram at SewBex if any of that interests you, and I will link it in the comments down below. I will also link this pattern down below. So I hope this video really helped you be more comfortable with this pattern and with your binding and creating this binding. There's lots of different options for this pattern. There's a tank top, there's a Henley placket. I do have a video with the tank top version with a Henley placket, and that will help if you're doing any of those options. You can kind of mix and match. So if you're doing the placket with this, that video will help. I'll link that in the description down below as well. And if you have any other questions, feel free to leave me a comment. And if you found this video helpful, make sure you give it a like and subscribe to my channel to be notified whenever I release a new video. Bye!